I walked into my own open house, with a police officer beside me. The sign on the lawn was cheerful in the pale morning light. Open house. Someone had stuck a little stack of glossy flyers on the front stoop. There were fresh flowers by the door, a pot of something bright that hadn't been there yesterday. A couple of folding chairs sat on the porch, like props. It looked normal enough. For a moment my hands went cold, and I had to steady myself against the doorframe. I am 71. I live in Ohio. The man beside me, Detective Sarah Brennan, touched my elbow, not as a warning, but to say I wasn't alone. Behind us, in an unmarked car down the street, my lawyer Robert sat very still. Dorothy, my friend, waited in the passenger seat with her hands folded like she was praying without moving her lips. The plan was simple and ugly. Let them try to sell my house. Let them make the mistake of doing it in public. That image, me crossing my own threshold with law enforcement, is the moment everything snapped into focus. But it didn't begin at that doorstep. It began 3 days earlier in a hospital room where the world felt like jello, and the monitor beeped a metronome for my body. The doctor used the word routine. They took out my gallbladder early on a Tuesday. I remember the antiseptic smell and how the paper gown rustled when I turned. The nurse brought jello that tasted like plastic. My son Brandon sat with me in the fluorescent light and promised he'd check the house, make sure the leaky gutter was fixed, that the lawn service would come. My daughter Jessica hovered in the doorway, eyes soft, talking about picking up my mail and bringing my slippers the next morning. Michael, the youngest, called from work and said he'd come by the day I was discharged to help me with groceries. They were my children. Their faces were the ones I had trusted for 7 decades. They had keys. They'd all stayed in my life long enough to know where I kept the spare key under the big ceramic frog out front. Family took care of family. That's what I'd always believed. I woke that first night at home with my stitches tight and a bottle of pills on the bedside table. I called Michael. He came over with soup and stayed to help me stand and hold the box of groceries while I rearranged the pantry. Brandon stopped by the next afternoon to mow the lawn. Jessica called to say she had taken my car to the shop for an oil change. It all felt ordinary until a woman I'd never met called me on Thursday morning. Her name was Patricia Holloway. She was a realtor I had never used. She sounded careful and a little nervous. "Mrs. Mitchell?" she said, and I said my name. Her voice was the kind that insisted on being polite because something felt wrong. "Someone brought a power of attorney into my office," she said. "They're trying to list your home." I laughed because it sounded like a bad joke. "List my home," I repeated. "I'm sitting here. I just came home from surgery." There was a pause. In that pause, I felt the room tilt. She explained that a document had been signed, a power of attorney that named Brandon as my legal agent, and that it gave him authority to list the property. Patricia said there were things about the document that didn't sit right with her professional instincts. The ink looked too new. The notarization stamp was faint. The signature didn't match the one she saw on file for me. She didn't want to move forward until she verified it with me. It was the last sentence she said that opened the door fully. "They told me you had a stroke," she said. "That you're not able to manage your affairs." I had gallbladder surgery. I had texted my friends jokes about the hospital pudding. I had not had a stroke. The words felt like a stranger had moved into my mouth. After I hung up, everything rearranged itself into a new pattern. Who would say such a thing? Why? I thought of the ceramic frog under the front porch where my spare key lived. I thought of my children clustered around the hospital bed. I thought of their busy lives and my reliance on them. For a second, I hoped it was a mistake. Maybe Brandon had signed something on my behalf with my knowledge. Maybe Jessica had rushed and filed paperwork she believed she had authority to do. But Patricia's voice had been steady, and she had a caller's caution that belonged to her job. Something didn't add up. I called Robert. He had been my lawyer for more years than I had been married. When I tell you he is the kind of man who keeps his cufflinks in a little velvet box and still remembers my birthday, you will understand why the thought of calling him felt like calling the Coast Guard in a storm. He listened without interrupting. When I told him Patricia's name and that someone had presented a power of attorney, he didn't say, "That's wrong." He said, "Bring me everything you have. Do not sign anything. Do not let anyone into your house who can't show you identification." He asked me for the originals of my trust documents, my deed, old bills. Dorothy dropped them off that afternoon in a bag that smelled faintly of lemon soap. Robert looked at the signature on the scanned POA she had forwarded. He squinted at his computer screen like he did when he took a difficult case. "This is not your signature," he said. "And the notary stamp. I've seen forgeries like this in probate court. They used a template and didn't bother to dirty it up. It wasn't merely the forged ink. It was the story that came with it. That I was incapacitated, that I could not speak, that I had suffered something far worse than an operation. Whoever had presented the POA had manufactured a narrative that justified moving my house into the market while I was recovering. When I told Dorothy, she put her hand over her mouth and said, 'Barbara, who could do this?' She didn't have to name a person. We both knew the list of people who had easy access to the house and to me. The grief started small and then gathered like a storm front. Betrayal feels like being stripped of choice. It feels like watching strangers trade your life like a card in a poker game. Patricia stayed in touch. She had not called anyone else. She said she wanted to make sure the listing could not proceed. "I couldn't just list it," she told me. "Something about it felt wrong. Your signature didn't flow the way signatures flow when someone is writing who they are." That image, the signature failing to flow, stuck with me. So did her refusal to proceed without my confirmation. It was one of the most human things anyone had done for me in that week. Detective Sarah Brennan came recommended by Robert. He knew people from county meetings and church luncheons. Sarah was young and moved with purpose. She smelled faintly of coffee and wore sensible shoes. When she came to the house, we sat at my kitchen table and she took notes. She asked the questions law enforcement asks. When did I last sign anything? Who had keys? Who had power of attorney in the past? Had I ever given anyone permission to sell? You learn something about the world when the people whose job it is to believe the worst find reason to do so. They don't look relieved. They look like people who do not like the shape of the world when they see it. Sarah told me what she had already confirmed. The POA had not been filed in the proper county records. The notary's seal was suspicious, but to nail a forgery, they'd need more than suspicion. They'd need to see the document signed under oath, or find the chain of emails or the meeting where the signature had been made. She recommended we keep the listing public while they gathered evidence. Sometimes, she said, the people who are doing it will make a mistake when they think no one's watching. That was the moment Robert leaned forward and gave me a look that felt like a small shield. We set a trap, he said simply. There was no drama in the way he said it. He said it like someone signing a letter. We attend the open house. We let them attempt to sell. We document who they are, who they talk to. Any offers. We bring a detective. We catch them. Catch them where? I asked, though I knew the answer. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was brittle. On your property, Robert said. Under your roof. In the living room that's been yours for 30 years. There were 102 reasons why I should have been terrified. The first, of course, was that they were my children. The second was that these were not strangers on the internet. These were people who had been with me through school plays and funerals and Sunday dinners. The third was that this was, in a very literal sense, my home. But another part of me, the part that had lived through enough winters to know when a lie could be stopped, felt buoyed. Somebody had listened. Patricia had listened. Robert had listened. Sarah had listened. That mattered. I told Michael. He came over that afternoon and sat on the edge of my bed like a man who had never been taught how to be small and careful at the same time. He rubbed my arm and said, "Mom, we have to do this your way." He had always been the steady one. He had not taken keys or documents. He had not signed anything. He had been the son who brought soup after the operation and did not make more requests than he could fulfill. We drew up a rough plan. The open house was scheduled for Saturday. Patricia had told me the time. She had been reluctant to post the listing online without my okay, but she had done so under the pressure of the people who brought the POA into her office. She agreed to let Sarah attend as a plainclothes detective. She agreed not to participate in the sale. Her role became witness and corroborator. She sent us the photocopy of the POA and a copy of the listing sheet that had the address and our house photographs. Robert made a list of documents to bring. My deed, my trust paperwork, the original signature cards from my bank. Dorothy brought extra copies of things I would later wish I had kept together. In the days between the call and the open house, I found myself cataloging small domestic things like evidence. I checked the under-sink cabinet for the repairman's warranty. I found a scratched marble coaster with a wine ring and thought of a Friday night when the children were small and we had popcorn that stuck to the bowl. I walked through the house like a detective myself. I touched the banister where my hand always landed. I opened the closet where the winter coats lived. I said hello to the ceramic frog. It felt absurd and sacred at the same time. At night I woke and replayed the hospital, the gurney, the nurse's clock. Brandon's hand squeezing mine as the anesthesia made the edges of the room soft. Jessica standing in the doorway with bright, careful eyes. I kept asking myself simple questions. Where did the love go? When had kindness been replaced by a ledger? I also kept reminding myself that this was not about me being clever. This was about the law. It was about rights. And it was about the small dignity of choosing what happens to your life. On Friday evening, Robert called to say the county clerk's office had confirmed there was no recorded power of attorney, matching the one Patricia had. He had spoken with the notary registries. The stamp on the document didn't match the notary's official stamp. It meant we had proof the POA was likely forged, but it also meant the people who presented it had gone to some trouble. People who go to that trouble don't always act alone. Sarah asked me to wear something that made me feel like myself. Comfortable, she said. Not showy, not to draw attention. If you see someone you know, you'll know how to handle it. If it escalates, stay with me, and we'll move you to the car. Robert wrote a short affidavit listing the facts as he understood them, and he told me he would be there. Dorothy folded under her arms a little bag with my glasses, my Bible, and a worn paperback novel she thought would calm me between visitors. Michael promised to stay within call. He gave me a look like he expected me to be brave, and I tried to be. When Saturday came, the sky was a clear blue you want to see through. The house looked the same as it always had, but the air felt electric, like the static before lightning. Detective Brennan met us at the curb and put her hand on my shoulder in the small, professional way detectives have. "We'll stay out of the way," she said. "Let them move. We'll watch." Patricia parked a little down the street. She would be our corroboration and witness, just in case. She had the listing sheet printed and tucked, like a bookmark, in her purse. There were neighbors who came by, some genuinely curious, some nosy, none of whom knew the full story. They asked the polite questions, how long I've lived there, what the neighborhood was like, and I answered them as one does when you are trying to make the scene as ordinary as possible. Nobody I spoke to that morning knew me as the woman who'd been called at home and told she had had a stroke. They knew me as the woman who had lived in the house for 30 years and baked for them at church. Under ordinary circumstances, that would have been enough. Under these circumstances, it felt like a costume. As people trickled into the living room, I watched them with a strange, clinical attention. 2 women with tote bags hovered by the fireplace. A man in a baseball cap smiled and pretended to be interested in the square footage. Someone took a flyer and flipped it open. There, on the coffee table, a brochure with glossy shots of my kitchen sat like an accusation. Then I saw them. Brandon was near the bay window, leaning against the shelf that held the old clock. He had a look of someone who thought they were about to finish a plan they'd rehearsed. Jessica stood by the hallway, pretending to browse photographs. They spoke in low tones, their mouths bent in familiar ways, as if the muscles had practiced those words for years. My chest tightened. My palms sweetened. I thought of that paper gown in the hospital, of the nurse's clock ticking me awake, of the jello that tasted of hospital lights. I realized then that there is a peculiar split second where your body decides whether you'll run or stay. That day, my feet felt planted. Michael had stayed back at the car with Robert and Dorothy. Patricia had closed the door of her car and sat watching from under her sunglasses. Detective Brennan kept one hand near her jacket where her badge was concealed. She did not put it out. She kept it where it was, like a promise. There were small, ordinary noises that morning that I will never forget. A child laughing on the sidewalk, a dog barking 2 houses down, the creak of the step as someone crossed the porch. Those noises were ordinary, and, in their ordinariness, they made the act taking place in my living room more obscene. It was as if the world insisted on continuing while your own life was being rewritten. I took one breath. Then I walked forward. I was careful with my steps. The hardwood felt familiar under my shoes, like the bottom of an ocean I've walked in for years. I had rehearsed nothing and everything. I had no speech prepared. I trusted that my presence would be the thing that dislodged the plan. We reached the foyer. The open house sign was visible through the glass. For a brief, surreal second, the scene felt theatrical, like a play I'd accidentally been cast in. Then the door opened and the room shifted. Conversation tapered into a silence you noticed like a breaker flipping. Brandon's face went from casual to suddenly blank. Jessica looked like someone who'd forgotten her lines. Detective Brennan stepped forward and said, in a clear voice that made the room hold itself, "Good morning. We're here on official business." My heart beat against my ribs like a small, angry fist. For all the things I had imagined in the quiet night since the phone call, I had not imagined the particular look on their faces when oppression meets proof. There is a moment where people meet the consequences of their actions, and their mouths find reasons. Some stumble into explanations like people finding their shoes in the dark. Others search their faces for understanding. I had seen enough of human faces to know the look of a person who believed they'd be protected by the weight of family ties. Brandon's mouth moved. Jessica's fingers found the edge of a photograph frame and clutched it as if holding onto it could anchor the moment. Around us, a small cluster of potential buyers stood frozen like furniture. They had come to see a kitchen island and instead found a family sitting on a fault line. At that exact second, when the room felt like it might tilt one way or the other, I remembered the nurse's clock. I remembered the smell of the antiseptic, the stitches at my side, the text messages that had seemed normal. I thought of the letters in my name and the way they'd been written across my life. I thought of Robert's steady voice telling me not to sign anything more. I reached for my next breath, feeling the door between past and present hanging open. If you're watching, tell me where you're from in the comments. The room held its breath as Detective Brennan reached into her jacket and pulled out a thin folder. She didn't wave it like a trophy. She laid it on my coffee table with the quiet of someone setting down a painful thing. Inside were copies of the paper Patricia had shown me, the photocopy she had kept in her purse, and a typed page from the county clerk saying there was no recorded power of attorney on file. There was a printed note from the notary registry showing the stamp numbers, and a match that didn't match. It was all small, ordinary paper, until someone read it and saw what it meant. Brandon's jaw tightened. Jessica's hand trembled around the edge of the frame she hadn't let go of. Detective Brennan spoke slowly, the way teachers in school used to speak to children who were trying to tell the truth. "This document is not yours," she said. "It appears to be forged. We've confirmed with the county there's no record. The notary's stamp has been misused." She looked at them, then at me. "We need to ask you some questions." They sagged, like curtains finally drawn. Brandon's voice was low when he spoke. "Mom, He stopped. The room tilted on that unfinished sentence. Jessica's eyes filled, and she pressed her thumbs together so hard it whitened the skin. In that pause, everything we had feared and everything we had hoped to avoid pressed into the same small place. "You have been trying to list this house while I was in the hospital," I said. The words didn't taste like vengeance. They smelled like something precise. Fact. There were explanations. There are always explanations. Jessica said hers first. The sound she used was not a grown woman's composure, but something younger. "We thought you couldn't manage things on your own," she said. "We thought you needed someone to take care of it, too." She couldn't finish the sentence without her voice cracking. She said in a rush, "We had bills. We thought selling would—" The rest fell into the space between us. Brandon's excuse came after hers, and it was smaller, like a coin taken from a pocket and set down. "We had debts," he said. "I thought I was doing what needed to be done. I didn't mean to hurt you." He kept looking at the photograph frame as if the faces in it would give him a map out of the room. Detective Brennan asked whether they had signed the document. They admitted they had presented it. They admitted the signature had been copied. They admitted they had used the spare key. They admitted they had told the realtor I had a stroke. When people you have loved for years begin to offer confessions, the sound is not satisfying. It is small and brittle and shaped by consequence. There was no melodrama in the living room that morning. No raised voices, no shouting. Only the slow, grinding recognition of what had been done. After the initial questioning, the detective stepped outside with Robert and Patricia and spoke in measured voices. I sat on my sofa, the one with the patch where the cat had sharpened her claws 20 years prior, and watched the light change in the bay window, my hands folded in my lap. Dorothy sat close enough to touch me if I needed it. Michael stood a little behind her, a hand resting on the back of a chair, as if steadying himself and me in the same motion. The house hummed with the kind of quiet you feel when the world takes a breath. I wasn't handcuffed. Nobody read me my rights. That morning was about evidence, not theater. The people who had come as potential buyers drifted away, polite and baffled, carrying glossy brochures they now looked at as if they contained a secret. The realtor, Patricia, stayed, her face a map of professional concern and personal pity. She had done something small and enormous. She had refused to be complicit in a lie. Later, when the detectives had the statements they needed, they asked me if I wanted charges to be filed. It felt almost absurd to think of this in terms of filing papers, of boxes stamped with red ink. But it was at last a route towards something that resembled accountability. Robert had been prepared for that conversation. He looked at me with a steadiness that felt like a small lifeline beacon. "Whatever you want, we'll proceed on your terms," he said. They took Brandon and Jessica in for interviews that afternoon. Michael and I walked the house as if examining a map. I checked the ceramic frog, made sure the spare place where a key had lived was empty. There was a hollow feeling in my chest. a physical absence that had nothing to do with the stitches under my skin and everything to do with trust being pried away. The county filed charges. The words felt clinical: elder abuse, forgery, attempted theft, but they had weight. Over the next weeks there were interviews, statements sworn at the county building, and the slow bureaucratic trudge that justice requires. Detective Brennan was careful and humane. She came to my kitchen table and sat with a tablet and a pen. She explained what would happen, 3 steps ahead, like someone reading a chessboard I couldn't see. Robert explained the legal language in smaller, softer pieces. Patricia answered questions that seemed to require no answer, like how she had felt when she first saw the document. The court dates gathered like clouds on a calendar. The DA's office weighed the evidence. They had the notch patterns of the signature, the notary's registry, and Patricia's testimony. They had the admissions. They also had to consider what would serve the public interest and what would give me the peace of mind I needed. The prosecutor offered a plea: plead guilty and accept restitution and supervision, or face trial. Trials are expensive and public and uncertain. The offer on the table was a promise of something that looked like repair, not revenge. I wrestled with the choice. I wrote nothing down that I wanted to happen, because this was not my courtroom to perform in. It was my life. I thought of mornings and afternoons, of teachers who had sat on my couch, of the neighbor's dog I had fed when its owner was sick. I thought of the small rituals of a life that had been nearly traded like a commodity. When the plea hearing happened, the courtroom felt like a place where time compressed. The clerk read the charges. My children were present, flanked by their counsel. The DA laid out the terms. It was clinical, but it was also deeply human. The offer was accepted. They would pay restitution, $25,000 each. They would be placed on 3 years supervised probation. They would complete 500 hours of community service. There would be a no-contact order, unless I chose to initiate contact in the future. The judge asked if they understood the terms and the consequences. They nodded. They entered guilty pleas. The word filled the room like an administration of truth. It wasn't triumphant. It was simply a closing of a chapter that had begun with a shaky, forged signature and a lie about a stroke. I do not pretend the legal outcome erased the wound. Money can be returned. Hours can be logged. Supervision can be imposed. But the fissure that opened between us did not simply fill with legal language. Standing in that courtroom, watching my children answer to the consequences of their actions, I felt a strange, layered thing. Relief and a weight that felt like the cost of the truth. After the hearing, Robert and I sat at a small table in the hallway outside the courtroom. People passed with their own dramas. Someone in a suit rushing. A clerk carrying a stack of folders, a woman with a paper cup. Dorothy came to squeeze my hand. Michael stayed near the doorway, his face a map of something like relief and sadness. I think he felt as I did that justice had been served in a narrow, necessary way. But justice had also taken something else. We changed the locks that week. We contacted the bank and updated signature cards and made sure no one could write checks or access accounts without multiple verifications. Robert helped me amend my trust and review my estate documents. He suggested practical steps I would not have thought to take on my own. We limited access to my mail, added a few protective measures, and let friends and neighbors know what had happened, so they could be more careful if something similar appeared in their lives. Friends who had been quietly watching offered small acts of kindness. Dorothy brought dinners for a while. The church women called and dropped off casseroles. Patricia would come by on occasion, not in her professional capacity, but as a neighbor who had been the one person to say, "This doesn't feel right," and then act. Michael, who had never been showy about emotion, was steady. He organized a list of people I trusted who could be reached in case of emergencies. He refused to accept any insinuation that he had been complicit. He had been one of the people who had shown up with soup and honest hands. As for Brandon and Jessica, the no-contact order made it clear that any attempt to interface with me would have to be initiated by me. They sent messages through their lawyers. We read them with a kind of hollow curiosity, and then set them aside. They expressed regret in court. Their words were formally recorded and part of the file. They had not gone to prison. They paid restitution, or at least they were ordered to. They were given terms intended to steer them away from repeating such acts. Whether those terms would change the trajectory of their choices would be something the future might reveal. In the neighborhood, people spoke less about the case and more about the mundane things that make up a life. The garden, the postman, the neighbor's new puppy. Sometimes I would see those faces and feel grateful for the ordinary that continued. Sometimes I would pass by the front step and think of the open house sign and the glossy flyer now folded in a drawer. The house remained mine. Its rooms were full of memory. Small stains on the carpet, my initials etched in the back of a kitchen cabinet, a patch on a curtain from when a curtain rod fell, and the children were small, and all we could do was laugh. There were hard conversations, too. Michael and I spoke late into the night about boundaries and the future. He said things in ways he had not before. He spoke of responsibility and of the kind of love that supports without taking. He came with me to appointments when I wanted company. He sat with me while I updated documents with Robert in his little office that smelled like old paper and lemon polish. I suppose everyone expects a single, clean moment of triumph in stories like this. There is none. I have a house that remains in my name, papers that have been tightened like the seam on a well-worn coat, and a new sense of caution that lives in the back of my mind like a moth in the attic. I also have a quiet ache where certain relationships used to be. The grandchildren, those small, forgiving people, still come sometimes. Michael brings them over with a careful plan, and we bake cookies and feed them milk out of the cup I always liked better. They don't ask about complicated things. They hum to themselves and pick blueberries from the bush out back. Their small faces, innocent and bright, have been a balm in ways that surprised me. I do not gloat. I do not imagine this is a story of triumph. It is a story of boundaries enforced, of a legal system that can sometimes do a tidy job of correcting a wrong, and of the cost of living when the people you trust make choices that betray you. Some nights I wake with my hand on the quilt and feel a fierce, patient grief. Other days I fold laundry and think about the seam that used to be my son's sweatshirt, and laugh with the kind of small, private amusement that carries me forward. People have asked me since, strangers in the grocery store, friends at church, what they should do if they suspect something like this. I do not give legal advice. I tell them what helped me. Listen to professionals who sound uncertain in a way that makes them careful. Do not sign anything you do not understand. Keep originals of important papers where someone you trust can get them quickly. And if a realtor or a banker has an instinct that something is wrong, take it seriously. Those are not instructions. Those are the small, honest things I learned on the way through. Detective Brennan's work deserves a small, plain thank you. She never made a show of being a hero. She did what detectives do. She gathered facts. She did not let narrative carry her away. And she afforded me dignity by doing her job with precise, careful hands. Patricia's refusal to proceed on a document that felt wrong is a lesson in professional ethics. Robert's steady, almost old-fashioned steadiness was a shelter. Dorothy's friendship was the ordinary, unflashy support that carries you to the next morning. Michael, my son who brought the soup, was the tether that kept me connected to something soft when the world became harsh. There are things I miss. There are things I will not easily get back. The trust I had in two of my children is fractured. The dinners feel different. When the phone rings now, I check the caller ID before I pick up. That small, practical change is less about fear and more about the wisdom that comes with age. You don't hand the keys to your life to someone because they say they care. You watch for the ways care is shown. I do not want to end with bitterness. I would rather end with a kind of warning that is edged with hope. Watch, ask questions, keep your papers in order, and pay attention to the quiet professional instincts of people whose job is to be careful. If something feels off, listen to the person whose job it is to notice. The realtor, the bank officer, the clerk at the county office. Mistakes happen, and sometimes those mistakes are honest. Sometimes they are not. The house fills with sun in the mornings now. I sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a small hand towel that has a faded tea stain and a story attached to it. I read the paper sometimes. I walk the yard and check the mailbox myself. I choose who has keys. I keep my phone on in the night, but I do not let fear live in my bones. People have asked me if I forgave them. Forgiveness is private and complicated, and not a thing I owe to anyone other than myself. Right now, forgiveness is a distance I measure, and not a thing I gift lightly. The legal resolution gave me a measure of protection. It did not return what was taken. We carry our losses in different ways. Mine sits beside the radiator, warm and plain. If this story has moved you, please share it. Tell someone you love about the danger of elder fraud. Talk to your elders about their documents and check in on the practical things. Where keys are kept, who can access accounts, and who knows where important papers are. I left a short list of resources in the description. Organizations that can help if you suspect abuse, fraud, or undue influence. I did not say those resources would do everything. I said they are a start. Thank you for listening to how my week in a surgical gown turned into a moment where I walked into my own open house with a police officer beside me. I kept my home. I paid a cost none of us wanted. I am still living. My hands are steadier. My heart is wiser. If you found anything in this story that matters, share it so someone else might be saved the hurt I felt. The link to elder fraud support and resources is in the description.